Have you ever met someone who seemed perfectly normal on the surface, but something about them felt wrong? Not loud, not aggressive, not obvious, just a feeling. A subtle signal your mind picked up before your conscious brain could explain it. The truth is, the most dangerous people rarely announce themselves. They don't walk into a room wearing a warning label. They blend in. They smile. They build trust. And sometimes, they become the very people we least suspect. Human behavior leaves clues, tiny patterns, small inconsistencies, repeated actions that reveal what's happening beneath the mask. Today, we're going to uncover 5 chilling behaviors that can signal something much darker hiding beneath the surface. These aren't movie villains or fictional monsters. These are real-world behavioral patterns that psychologists, investigators, and behavioral experts have observed time and time again. Now, it's important to understand seeing one of these behaviors doesn't automatically make someone evil. Human beings are complex. Context matters. But when these patterns appear consistently, and especially when several of them show up together, they can reveal a mindset driven by manipulation, exploitation, and a shocking lack of empathy. By the end of this video, you'll start noticing things most people completely miss. You'll understand why your instincts sometimes warn you before the evidence appears. And you may never look at certain behaviors the same way again. Let's begin with behavior number 1. Have you ever noticed how some people can endure far more disappointment than most? They keep giving chances long after others would have walked away. They listen when nobody else wants to listen. They forgive things that would have ended most relationships instantly. They see the pain behind someone's behavior, the insecurity behind someone's anger, and the fear behind someone's mistakes. Because of this, they often become the person everyone turns to when life falls apart. But there's something many people misunderstand about highly empathetic individuals. Their willingness to forgive should never be confused with an unlimited tolerance for betrayal. Trust is one of the most valuable things an empath gives away. Not because they hand it out carelessly, but because when they choose to trust someone, they do it completely. They invest emotionally. They remember details. They pay attention to your struggles. They celebrate your victories. They become emotionally connected to your well-being in a way that most people never fully understand. For them, relationships aren't transactions. They aren't constantly keeping score. They aren't measuring every favor or counting every mistake. They are trying to build something real. That's why betrayal affects them differently. The first time someone lies to them, they often search for an explanation rather than a punishment. They wonder what pressure the person was under. They wonder what fear caused the deception. They wonder whether there is something deeper happening beneath the surface. Most people react to betrayal by asking, "How could they do this to me?" An empath is more likely to ask, "What happened that caused them to make this choice?" That difference is important because it explains why they stay longer than most people would. When someone disappoints them, they don't immediately assume malicious intent. They look for context. They search for understanding. They try to see the situation from every angle. This is why manipulative people are often drawn toward empathetic individuals. They quickly realize that the empath, not because they don't care, because they're tired. Tired of explaining the same pain. Tired of hearing the same promises. Tired of watching temporary improvements followed by the same behavior returning. And that silence is often misunderstood. The other person thinks everything is getting better because the complaints have stopped. The tension seems lower. The conversations seem calmer. The conflict appears to be fading away. In reality, the empath may simply be reaching acceptance. Acceptance that the person they're dealing with is unlikely to change. Acceptance that the relationship may never become what they hoped it could be. Acceptance that protecting their own peace has become more important than preserving the connection. This is why their departure often surprises people. The manipulator is shocked. The liar is shocked. The person who kept breaking promises is shocked. Because they assumed they had more time. They assumed there would be another chance. They assumed the empath would continue tolerating behavior that should have ended long ago. But once an empath reaches emotional certainty, their exit can be remarkably quiet. No dramatic speech. No campaign for revenge. no desperate attempt to prove a point. They simply stop investing their energy where it is no longer valued. They stop fighting for a relationship that only one person is trying to save. And when they finally leave, they often leave completely. Not because they stopped caring overnight, not because they became cold, but because repeated betrayal eventually taught them a painful lesson. Sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do is stop giving endless opportunities to someone who keeps proving they don't respect them. The tragedy is that many people only recognize the value of an empath after they're gone. They miss the patience. They miss the understanding. They miss the loyalty. They miss having someone who genuinely wanted the best for them. By then, however, the decision has usually been made. The trust that took years to build has been worn away by repeated choices, repeated betrayals, and repeated evidence that words alone were never enough. And once that trust is gone, the silence that follows can be permanent. There is a dangerous assumption that many people make when they encounter someone who is deeply empathetic. They mistake kindness for weakness. They mistake patience for passivity. They mistake understanding for a lack of boundaries. At first glance, it can seem like the empath is willing to tolerate almost anything. They stay calm when others become angry. They remain compassionate when others become judgmental. They continue offering support long after most people would have walked away. To someone looking from the outside, it can appear as though they have no limits at all. But that perception couldn't be further from the truth. What makes an empath unique is not that they lack boundaries. It's that they often give people enough room to reveal who they truly are. They don't rush to conclusions. They don't immediately assume the worst. They understand that everyone struggles. Everyone makes mistakes. Everyone carries invisible burdens. Because of this, they often extend grace where others would extend criticism. Unfortunately, some people see this grace as an opportunity. They notice that the empath forgives quickly. They notice that the empath listens patiently. They notice that the empath continues showing up even after being disappointed. And instead of appreciating those qualities, they begin testing them. At first, the tests are small, a promise gets broken, a favor is taken for granted, an act of kindness goes unacknowledged. The empath notices but chooses understanding over confrontation. They assume the person is stressed, distracted, overwhelmed, or struggling with something unseen. They don't immediately react because they know life is complicated. They know people aren't perfect. But what happens next reveals everything. A respectful person recognizes the gift they've been given. They appreciate the patience. They correct their behavior. They become more careful with the trust they've been offered. A selfish person does the opposite. They interpret the absence of consequences as permission, and patterns reveal intentions. Eventually, the empath starts asking difficult questions. If I stopped helping this person, would they still be here? If I stopped solving their problems, would they still care about the relationship? If I stopped being useful, would I still be valued? Those questions can be uncomfortable because the answers often expose realities that have been hidden for a long time. Many people become attached to what an empath provides rather than who the empath actually is. They become attached to the emotional support, the encouragement, the validation, the patience, the understanding, the stability. But genuine relationships require mutual investment. They require reciprocity. They require both people contributing to the connection. Without that balance, the relationship slowly transforms into something else entirely. A transaction disguised as a friendship, an arrangement disguised as love, a dependency disguised as connection. What makes this especially dangerous is that exploitative people often become incredibly comfortable. They assume the empath will always remain available. They assume forgiveness is automatic. They assume loyalty is guaranteed. They stop making an effort because they believe the relationship is secure no matter what they do. This false sense of security causes them to overlook subtle changes. The empath begins sharing less. The empath begins investing less emotionally. The empath begins pulling back their energy, not out of anger, not out of revenge, out of awareness. They are beginning to recognize the difference between being appreciated and being used. And once that distinction becomes clear, something shifts internally. The desire to keep sacrificing starts disappearing. the motivation to keep carrying the relationship alone begins fading. The emotional investment that once felt natural starts feeling exhausting. Many people expect empaths to react with dramatic confrontations when this happens. They imagine explosive arguments or emotional ultimatums. But often the opposite occurs. The empath becomes quieter, more observant, more selective. Instead of arguing, they start paying attention. Instead of demanding change, they start evaluating reality. They stop focusing on promises and start focusing on actions. And actions rarely lie. Every ignored boundary, every selfish decision, every moment of taking without giving, every instance of appreciation being replaced with entitlement, all of it becomes evidence. Eventually, the empath reaches a point where the situation no longer feels confusing. There is no uncertainty left. There is no debate left. The pattern has become obvious. They understand exactly what kind of relationship they're participating in. And perhaps most importantly, they understand exactly what it is costing them. Their peace, their emotional energy, their mental well-being, their self-respect. At that moment, walking away no longer feels like a loss. It feels like self-preservation. The people who took their kindness for granted are often the most shocked when this happens. They never saw it coming because they were focused on what they were receiving rather than what the empath was experiencing. They assumed patience meant permanence. They assumed forgiveness meant permission. They assumed loyalty meant unlimited access. They never imagined that the same person who tolerated so much could one day decide they had enough. But that's the mistake people make when they confuse kindness with weakness. Kindness is a choice. Patience is a choice. Understanding is a choice. And when someone repeatedly abuses those gifts, the empath eventually makes another choice. Not to fight, not to punish, not to seek revenge, simply to stop offering their energy to someone who never truly valued it. And when that decision is finally made, it often arrives with no warning at all. One day, the person who always answered the call stops answering. The person who always showed up stops showing up. The person who always carried the emotional weight quietly puts it down and walks away. Not because they stopped caring, but because they finally realized that caring for others should never require abandoning themselves. There is a difference between being heard and being understood. Most people spend their lives wanting both, but for highly empathetic individuals, that need runs even deeper. They are often the ones who notice emotional shift. These moments may seem small to the person causing them. A careless comment, a sarcastic response, a dismissive shrug, a change of subject, an eye roll, a quick explanation for why the empath shouldn't feel the way they do. But emotionally, these moments accumulate. Every dismissal sends a message. Every minimization communicates something. Every invalidated feeling leaves an impression. And the message becomes increasingly clear. Your emotions matter less here. Your experiences matter less here. Your pain is inconvenient. Your needs are secondary. The empath may not immediately react to this message. In fact, they often do the opposite. They try harder to communicate. They search for better words. They attempt to explain themselves more clearly. They assume the problem is a misunderstanding that can be solved through patience and honesty. So they open up again and again and again, each time hoping for connection, each time hoping for understanding, each time hoping the other person will finally recognize what they're trying to express. Sometimes that understanding arrives. But when it doesn't, something begins changing beneath the surface. A person can tolerate disagreement. A person can tolerate conflict. A person can tolerate mistakes. What becomes difficult to tolerate is feeling invisible. The empath starts noticing a pattern. They notice that their feelings are only acknowledged when they are convenient. They notice that conversations repeatedly return to the other person's needs. They notice that emotional support flows in one direction. They become aware that while they spend enormous amounts of energy understanding others, very little effort is being invested in understanding them. This realization is deeply painful because empaths don't typically expect perfection. They don't expect people to read minds. They don't expect every conversation to go perfectly. What they hope for is sincerity, effort, a genuine willingness to understand. When even that becomes absent, disappointment begins transforming into emotional distance. What's interesting is that most people don't recognize this process while it's happening. They assume the relationship is functioning normally because there are no dramatic arguments, no explosive confrontations, no ultimatums, no public declarations. The empath may still smile. They may still participate in conversations. They may still show kindness. But internally, they are beginning to withdraw. Not because they want to, because they're protecting themselves. Human beings naturally move toward environments where they feel understood and away from environments where they feel invisible. The empath is no different. The only difference is that they often stay much longer than they should because they keep hoping things will improve. Hope can be powerful. It can keep someone invested long after logic says they should leave. It can encourage patience when frustration would be easier. It can inspire forgiveness when resentment would be justified. But hope cannot survive indefinitely without evidence. Eventually, reality starts outweighing optimism. The empath begins noticing that every vulnerable conversation follows the same pattern. They express something important. The other person dismisses it, deflects it, minimizes it, or somehow makes the conversation about themselves. At first, the empath may feel frustrated, then disappointed, then exhausted, and finally something unexpected happens. They stop sharing. This moment is often misunderstood. The other person assumes everything is improving because the complaints have stopped. The difficult conversations become less frequent. The emotional discussions disappear. The relationship feels more peaceful. But what appears to be peace is often disengagement. The empath is no longer trying to be understood because they no longer believe understanding is possible. Think about how significant that shift is. A person who once wanted connection now expects disconnection. A person who once fought for communication now chooses silence. A person who once believed the relationship could grow now begins accepting its limitations. In reality, they often leave because they become exceptionally clear about reality. They stop focusing on intentions and start focusing on outcomes. Maybe the other person doesn't mean to be dismissive. Maybe they don't realize the impact of their behavior. Maybe they have their own struggles. The empath understands all of that. But understanding someone's reasons does not erase the consequences of their actions. A relationship cannot thrive on explanations alone. It requires effort, awareness, mutual care. When those elements remain absent, emotional connection slowly fades. And here's what makes this process so surprising to others. The empath usually leaves long before they physically leave. Emotionally, they begin detaching months earlier. They stop expecting support. They stop expecting understanding. They stop expecting change. By the time they finally create distance, they have already spent a long period grieving the relationship privately. That is why their departure often feels sudden to everyone else. The signs were there. The withdrawal was happening. The emotional investment was decreasing. But because it happened quietly, nobody noticed. The person who once shared everything now shares very little. The person who once reached out constantly becomes distant. The person who once fought for the relationship becomes calm. And that calmness is often mistaken for contentment. In reality, it may be acceptance. Acceptance that some people are unwilling to understand what they refuse to value. Acceptance that constantly explaining your pain to someone who dismisses it only creates more pain. Acceptance that emotional connection cannot survive where emotional needs are consistently ignored. And once that acceptance takes hold, something changes permanently. The empath stops searching for validation from the very people who withheld it. They stop chasing understanding from those unwilling to offer it. They stop trying to convince others that their feelings matter. Instead, they quietly move toward places, relationships, and people where they no longer have to prove that their emotions deserve respect. And when that moment arrives, they rarely leave with anger. They leave with clarity. A clarity built from countless conversations, countless disappointments, and countless reminders that feeling understood is not a luxury in a healthy relationship. It is a necessity. If you've been paying close attention, you'll notice a pattern running through everything we've discussed today. It isn't the betrayal itself that causes an empath to leave. It isn't the mistakes. It isn't even the conflict. It's what happens when those things become patterns instead of exceptions. When trust is broken repeatedly. when kindness is treated like weakness, when feelings are dismissed instead of understood. An empath doesn't usually walk away because of one bad day. They walk away after countless moments that slowly reveal a painful truth, a truth they tried not to see, a truth they hoped would change, a truth they gave every opportunity to become different. But eventually, reality becomes impossible to ignore. And when that moment arrives, something remarkable happens. They stop explaining. They stop chasing. They stop convincing. They stop fighting battles that only one person is trying to win. Not because they stopped caring, but because they finally started caring about themselves too. The people who lose an empath often spend months, sometimes years, trying to understand what happened. They replay conversations. They revisit memories. They search for the exact moment everything changed. What they usually fail to realize is that the ending didn't happen in a single moment. It happened in 1,000 small moments, 1,000 chances, 1,000 opportunities to listen, appreciate, respect, and value someone who was giving far more than they were receiving. And by the time the empath finally disappears, they have already made peace with the decision. So here's the question. Think about the people in your life right now, the ones who support you, the ones who listen when nobody else will, the ones who stand beside you during difficult times, the ones who continue showing up even when it's inconvenient. Are you appreciating them? Or are you assuming they'll always be there? Because some of the most valuable people you'll ever meet don't leave loudly. They leave quietly. And when they do, the silence they leave behind can teach lessons that their words never could. If this message made you think differently about the relationships in your life, then take a moment to reflect on the people who genuinely care about you. Sometimes the greatest mistake isn't losing the wrong person. It's taking the right person for granted until they're gone forever. And that's something many people don't realize until it's too late